Sunday after elections, and I thought I would just come to my office and make a bunch of videos. And so I hope you will find this video helpful. This video is really about what I'm often talking about in this channel, which is attachment, and really the things that people do as a result of their own childhood behaviors that really are destructive to their relationships. And so I'm just going to talk today about attachment in terms of avoidance and anxious attachment, and kind of like what you might be doing that is really not helping your relationship today. All right. Before I get started though, I'm Dr. Kim Sage. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I hope you will consider subscribing and clicking the bell, and that way you'll get notified when I post new videos. All right, so let's talk about what people with avoidant attachment do. The handful of things that they tend to do that can be very destructive to relationships. Now, just a quick reminder, avoidant attachment is one of the 4 attachment styles. We have insecure, anxious, insecure, avoidant, secure, and disorganized. But today I'm just going to talk about, as I said, anxious and avoidant, right? Avoidant attachment really is this concept of what we call repeated maternal rejection. Now, that sounds like a really strong word, rejection, but what we really mean is that in childhood, those who had parents who were dismissing often dismissed the child's needs, didn't see them, dismiss them, minimize them, which the child experiences as rejection. And so that's why we say that avoidant attachment is about repeated maternal, because most of the studies were done on moms, but this really just applies to the primary caregiver, whoever that may be, rejection, right? And so the message is often around, performance over who you are, what you can deliver. Not a lot of memories often for those who have avoidant attachment. They'll say, yeah, I had a pretty good childhood. When you ask them to give you details, they often can't do that. So the first thing I think we do when we have avoidant attachment is we can send mixed signals. At the core of avoidant attachment is this fear of being consumed, this fear of too much vulnerability. And so avoidant people with these tendencies want relationships. It's just they're very wary of how much too much closeness of what that will do to them. And so they can often send these mixed signals where, that you think they're into you, and then the minute that gets a little too close, they disengage. And so that's a problem, because if you're not being clear with your intentions, your partner has to then fill in the data in their own minds about what they think you want or don't want. And sometimes avoidant people can say, yeah, I thought things were fine, and they aren't fine, and it's too late, and the relationship is over, and their partner has moved on. The next one I think that avoidants do in terms of attachment is they often overvalue their independence, and they're often such internal processors that they're sort of always on this island, as Stan Tatkin, calls it, off in their own world. And they have this sort of dreamy auto-regulation. They tend to get lost in their own mind, their own selves, and they also need to have that alone time. It's kind of in some regards similar to how we think about introversion, meaning that introverts tend to need time alone to regulate. Those who are avoidant need their own space and time to regulate as well. Now, they can be extroverts who do that, but at the core, it's like this internal way of processing that at times can feel very removed from connection. But for them, that is how they sort of get themselves back on track and how they feel most comfortable and most safe. Because in that world, in that space, no one can really intrude. And I've learned to take care of myself because my needs were dismissed. And so that's where I feel most comfortable. But that's also going to feel really bad if you want to be in a relationship, if your partner wants to be with you, because you're always going to feel a bit removed from them. And that really doesn't do a lot for connection. Also, those really quickly who have this attachment style will often do a lot of things on their own, like hobbies, work, sports, whatever they're doing, weekends with friends. They often tend to overdo their alone time, and that might be wrapped up in learning a new skill or going to a training or, learning a new hobby. But they tend to do that, and that really creates a sense of isolation and loneliness in their partners. And if you have this style, you have a partner who's probably saying, you're never here, you never do things with me, why do you have to have 7,000 hobbies, stuff like that. The next thing we see with avoidant attachment is an unrealistic view of romance. And this is, I did this little video on Schitt's Creek because I love Schitt's Creek so much, but there's a scene where Patrick tells David, stop watching Notting Hill, David. It's this idea that like everything else is like this rom-com, this movie scene. And so when you have this style, you can really, miss the romance in your own partner, because in your mind it needs to be bigger and better and different. And or you always think that the next person who comes along is going to be the one. And you have a hard time seeing the person for who they are, the relationship for what it is, and in your effort to have the perfect this new pillow has hair everywhere. In your effort to have the perfect romanticized situation, you often miss the beautiful person standing right in front of you. The next thing we see with avoidant attachment is being too rigid, not good at compromise, needing to have things your way or the highway. And it's because people with this style feel more comfortable that way, and yet they feel more in control, but it really lacks flexibility and reciprocity in a relationship when you're like this, and it makes your partner feel like they don't matter. Next thing we tend to see is mistrust, and this idea that at the core people aren't safe, and so I can never be too close or too vulnerable, and there's a fear there. And that fear makes this person who has this style less likely to ask for help, less likely to open up, more likely to pull away when they're flooded emotionally and not know how to express themselves, which makes the partner once again feel isolated and alone and not really reciprocal and connected. Along those lines, people with avoidant attachment also tend to shut down, right? Like I just said. So they often give you the silent treatment. They're so flooded, like I just said, that they don't know how to engage and resolve conflict. And if you add in rigidity and emotional distancing, it's really hard to create a situation where you can work things out. And so things are often left unresolved year in and year out. And as I always say, we have to fill in the data, right? If I don't know what I think you really feel, I have to make up something in my head, like Brene Brown says. And so the story in my head is that you don't love me, you don't want to be with me, you don't care about me, I'm not good enough for you. Now, those things may be what you're thinking, but oftentimes they're not. But that is what happens when you don't know how to communicate, you shut down, you disengage, and you don't know how to connect and resolve really your feelings and your conflict. The last one that's often common we see with avoidant attachment is a frequency of negative moods. And I think this is because people with this style are often in their head, they're often trying to regulate, they often feel flooded, and it can come out as kind of a crankiness and a grumpiness and a difficulty with just moodiness in general that is really not healthy for a relationship. If you're always bringing negative, moody energy and you think I should just be okay with it because you're not being overtly abusive or disrespectful, you are seriously going to find out that it is not going to work for you, because that negative energy is something that is very toxic and unhealthy. As I talk about our nervous systems, right? If your mood is negative, I'm going to automatically assume for most partners that it's about me, that I did something wrong, and or it's just not fun to be around. It's not enjoyable. And so if your partner tells you you're always in a bad mood, you're always cranky, you're always negative, your tone is always intense, it's time for you to think about changing that, because it definitely will hurt your relationship. And yes, you probably learned that strategy to survive in your childhood, but it is not helpful in your adult relationships. The next set of attachment behaviors that I think are very destructive for relationships really fall in the anxious attachment category. Now, remember, attachment has this sort of spectrum. It can vary, and with some people it can go one way or the other. I think we have our general styles and we can lean into other styles. But let's say you have an anxious attachment style. What does that look like, and how does it affect your relationship? The first thing to remember if we think about anxious attachment is that these were people who were often overly involved in the caretaker state of mind. There was often inconsistency and unresponsiveness, and so it's sort of this mixed signal that was sent from the primary caregiver, sometimes available, sometimes not available. And what often happens is those who have this attachment style often end up being on high alert, right? They are always scanning for safety, security, fight or flight. And maybe it was because there was a lot of anger in the home, could be that too. But the core of it is this sort of maternal unresponsiveness and inconsistency. At times there could be really strong bonds with the caregiver. At times they were not so much there. And so the way we describe this one is hope and disappointment, repeated again and again and again. So what happens with those who have this attachment style primarily is they're often strong caretakers. They have learned to be overly involved in the parent's state of mind. and they're often strong caretakers as a result. And so they're really good at taking care of everyone else. They're always scanning for making sure everyone is good. Is everyone okay? The problem is they often neglect themselves and their own needs. And if you're on the receiving end of a strong caretaker, it might feel really good for you. But eventually it'll backfire because it's a one-way deal going on where your needs are getting met, but the person who's providing that is not getting their needs met. And eventually it plays out in a breakdown, in a health breakdown, in a relational breakdown, or some sort of issue where it becomes apparent that the person who's caretaking cannot maintain that. And it is not healthy for relationships, because the person doing it obviously gets sick, almost every area of the relationship eventually, because no one can sustain that. The other problem with being a strong caretaker and a pleaser is that you often don't know what you want or what you need. So it's like, well, what do you want for dinner? Which, by the way, is a very common argument, right? And the person who's like this says, I don't care, I don't know, I don't care. And they'll say to me like, well, I don't really care. But when it really comes down to it, sometimes they do. That they've learned to disregard their needs in an effort to get their needs met in a sort of the global way. And over time, that erodes sense of self, it erodes value, and it erodes reciprocity in the relationship. Next one is those who have anxious attachment tend to be game players. They don't know how to be as vulnerable and raw and open at times in a more stable way. And so they will be really good at sending sort of mixed signals and playing games to sort of test the relationship. Do you care about me? Do you love me? Do you miss me? And it'll be things like, oh, I went to bed with my phone on, but I didn't see your call till tomorrow. You know, things like that, just trying to get little ways to test, do you care and do you love me? The problem is that creates, it's a sort of ground of inconsistency and instability that doesn't lend itself to security in a relationship. The next thing we see with anxious attachment is they tend to have a high need for their relationship to be stable. And so in their desire to have everything be good, they will often overlook what isn't so good. They'll minimize, they'll justify, they won't pay attention to until it gets so big they can't avoid it anymore. And then it can often be too late. And so the need for things to be good often creates this sort of blinder situation about what's really going on, including their own needs and also yours. And clearly that is not going to be helpful as we want to learn to go through relationships and heal and communicate and things like that. And they also do this thing where they tend to need to be externally regulated. So they need you to be okay so they can be okay. And that's that one-way communication, like I was saying, where it's like, if it's all about me making sure you're okay, I'm missing half of the equation, which is, am I okay? In addition, we often see them needing to talk about the details and like go into every little thing, which can be exhausting sometimes. They can tend to put their partners on pedestals, and in this effort to keep things good, they can only focus on the good qualities. And this is why breakups can be so hard for them, because we all do this, but they really do this where they're focusing on only the good stuff. And their brains have a tendency to want to focus on that stuff that felt so good and rewarding, but neglected their own needs. The next thing we see with anxious attachment is that there's often a lot of jealousy and clinginess and neediness. And you know what the research shows is a little bit of jealousy is actually a good thing. You know, if you're never jealous, frankly not so good. We want it to know a little bit that you care, that it kind of bothers you. We don't want the extreme, that you're psychotic about it and crazy about the jealousy, and we don't want you not caring at all. And so, but often with the anxiety that goes with anxious attachment, that scanning for it to be right and that fear and that rejection, all that's like swirling around can make the person be overly needy, overly clingy. And that doesn't feel like healthy stability. It can feel like, you know, clinging for dear life, which doesn't feel good in a relationship. Not for the person and not for the partner. The next one is because they often have a strong fear of abandonment and being left, they often think that because of all this, you know, needs and emotionality, that no one will be able to handle them or tolerate them, and that they'll always be too much for people. And they can't be their real selves because their real selves are so needy. And that's obviously going to be destructive over time, because if all I feel is that you're needy and not holding your own ground in the relationship, it doesn't feel like a balance. I always say it's like a seesaw, ready to show up and down. Not always evenly up and down, but sometimes, you know, one or the other. But for the most part, there is a reciprocity to it. And if it's a one-way situation where it's all about my insecurity and my needs and my fear that you're going to leave me, then I'm going to not be as desirable to most partners, and it's not going to feel like a healthy, stable, secure, trusting area of the relationship I can lean into. It's going to feel very one way. The next thing we see is a high need to be positively evaluated and a fear of being rejected and needing lots of approval. And that kind of goes back to, meeting the caretaker state of mind and being a pleaser. But the result of that is that because this attachment style has so much fear for being evaluated negatively, they're often seeking it out. They're looking for any signs to reinforce that you don't love them, that you don't care about them. There's such a need for approval that anything that feels like you didn't see them can cause a conflict or cause arguments, cause fights. And that's a problem because, once again, it's all a one-way situation. It's all about you and my fear of not upsetting you and keeping you happy and making you feel loved. But what about my needs? So if you're the anxious person and I'm doing that, I'm also a partner in the relationship too, and I'm not probably going to get my needs met as much because I'm so worried about keeping you somewhat stable and not triggering you. And that's not going to be good for your relationship at all. Once again, you probably did that back in your childhood because you had to read that caregiver, but it is not healthy in an adult relationship. The last thing we often see in anxious attachment is a fear of being alone and a difficulty tolerating alone space. And so there's always this need to fill it up with people, with animals, with experiences. It's like they can't often handle the sound of their own voice, the space of their own being in the room. And so they often need to stay in close physical contact with people. Now, there's nothing wrong with needing people. And in fact, people with anxious attachment can be very affectionate and need to have lots of touching and cuddling and hugging and intimacy. And those are all good things for most people, unless their partner isn't. But it cannot be to this point where it's like a vacuum, sucking it all up at all times to just fill up that vacancy inside. There needs to be a tolerance for being alone mentally, physically, and emotionally, as appropriate. We all have different variations in that. But it cannot be from a desperate need to fill the alone space. It has to be from a place of, as I keep saying, reciprocity and stability. So I hope you found this was helpful. I hope you will know that we all do these things. We all develop these behaviors and strategies to survive our childhoods. And I say survive in everything from extreme childhoods to just our regular growing up and learning how to deal with adults and parents and siblings and teachers and all of that. But, these core relationships to self, I do truly believe, are built in those early years and throughout our childhoods with our caregivers. Of course, things like losses, traumas, divorces, all of that affects our attachment. And so, or even an illness, a parent going through, let's say, cancer, and even if they survive, all of that's going to affect it. And I hope you will use this to know that having compassion and love for yourself about where you develop these is really important. But as I keep saying, you cannot heal what you don't understand. And if you can't see it, you can't heal it. So I hope you found this helpful. I hope you will consider, if you have a partner, maybe talking about these things that, well, what do you think I do that causes issues in our relationship? And where do you think that comes from? And what I love about attachment is that it kind of takes the blame off of like, you're bad and you do this thing. It kind of gives us a lens to say, oh, I get why you do this. Your mom was really intense. She was never available. Or your mom was a yeller and a rager and you were always scanning. No wonder you're always scanning for me to be mad at you. Let's figure this out. Let's work through it. Maybe get therapy. Maybe read some books together. Whatever it takes. And so I hope you will do that. Thank you so much for watching. Please stay safe and well. I hope this next week is a more peaceful, easy week. And don't forget to subscribe and click the bell. And I'll see you next time. Bye guys. Thanks for watching.